Is it a wedding ring?
It does look like a wedding ring.
Yeah, I see that. It looked like okay. I know what to do.
Well, let's get the evening off to a big start.
Well, if anybody can claim it, it'll be in my pocket, and then I'll leave it here tonight. Okay?
Yeah, we
This is not out of a Cracker Jack box. Okay, on the bill, please.
Good evening. Since Mark is one of our speakers, I thought he shouldn't have to introduce himself. So I want to introduce our speakers tonight. We're glad to have Maharat Rori Neiss with us tonight. She's the Executive Director for the Jewish Community Relations Council in St. Louis. And she and Mark have known each other a long time and have worked together before. And most of you know Mark Etling from our own staff. We were very happy that Mark could join our staff a year ago, and we have had no regrets, so I hope he hasn't either. And the two of them will talk about the prophet Isaiah tonight and fasting, and so that they can do the speaking, let me just welcome them both.
Thank you all for having me tonight. So I'm just going to dive in. I think the format, as I understand it, is that I'm going to speak for a little while, Mark will speak for a little while, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I'll also say, as a precursor and a bit of a warning, we haven't talked about this yet, so I have no idea if Mark's going to like what I say or not, and I don't know what his reaction is going to be. So we'll just do it all live and see where it goes. So when we start to talk about Isaiah from a Jewish perspective, I think it's first important to recognize the fact that even though Jewish and Christian, and specifically Catholic Bibles, share the book of Isaiah, we actually read them as very different texts. And so we're not going to have time to go through the entirety of the book, but as we look at some of the specific verses, the way that we read the verses are inherently going to be different, and our understanding of the messaging of Isaiah is going to be different. And so I'm going to beg your indulgence that when we go through these texts, I'm not just going to be reading the texts with you, but kind of doing them in a Jewish way, so to speak, which may be familiar to some of you and may be completely new to some of you. And if I go very far afield and confuse you, just wave your hands and I'll try to bring it back. So before I can get to the text in Isaiah, and I know we have a slide up here that you can ignore for just a moment, what becomes really significant in the Jewish tradition about Isaiah, and specifically Isaiah 58, is not just where the text itself resides, but how we utilize the text in tradition. Specifically, the chapter of Isaiah, chapter 58, is read in the Jewish tradition on the morning of the holiday of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, which just took place about 3 weeks ago, is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. And so the first text, you have some source sheets in front of you, and the first text that I brought for you comes from Leviticus chapter 16, verses 29 to 31. The translations come from the Jewish Publication Society, so if you don't like the translation, you can take it up with them. Right, and this is where we first learn about the holiday of Yom Kippur. This shall be to you a law for all time. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall practice self-denial. You shall do no manner of work, neither the citizen nor the alien who resides among you. For on this day atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you of all your sins, and you shall be clean before the Lord. It shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you shall practice self-denial. It is a law for all time. Leviticus, specifically chapter 29, I highlighted for you here. So for those of you, I hope you're all practicing your Hebrew tonight. Right, so what that reads there is, Anu et nafshotechem. And I didn't give you the English because I wanted to make sure you had to listen to me. What it translates to is, here it comes up as, you shall practice self-denial, but, right, nafshotechem, nefesh is your soul, right? And so in a sense, it's really kind of this practice of denial of your body, the denial of the flesh. Nefesh actually could be body more so, right? So it's this denial of the body, right? And that's what we're talking about on Yom Kippur. And there's a lot of other traditions in terms of Yom Kippur, what exactly this day is, why it's this day. Most specifically, our tradition tells us that it's on this day that God ultimately forgives the Israelites for the sin of the golden calf. Not that they get off scot-free, for those of you who know that story, right? Which is also a key part of Yom Kippur. Forgiveness does not mean a total eradication of what has been done, but is the moment when God says, I'll accept your prayer and I will forgive you. And so that day then gets marked down as the historical day, I guess, so to speak, right? But here we have in Leviticus this commandment that it's on this day, not only that we have this atonement, but that we need to have this rest and this abstinence from other activities. This gets repeated in Numbers chapter 29, 7 to 11. On the 10th day of the same 7th month, you shall observe a sacred occasion when you shall practice self-denial. You shall do no work. You shall present to the Lord a burnt offering of pleasing odor, 1 bull of the herd, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs. See that they are without blemish. The meal offering with them of choice flour with oil mixed in shall be... Okay, so you get the idea of it. I brought this text also because we read this text specifically on Yom Kippur as part of the Torah reading. So whenever we have a holiday or a Sabbath, we take out the text of the Torah, and we read, if it's a Sabbath, we read whatever the portion is that we're up to. So we just started again, so we're doing Noah this week, right, and we continue on from there. On holidays, we read the relevant portions related to the holidays. And so interestingly, on Yom Kippur, this is the text specifically from Numbers, and so the rabbis who have established of old what the readings will be decided that it was important for us to read this text specifically. And in particular because in a time when we no longer bring sacrifices, we tell the story of the sacrifices instead. So it becomes sort of this replacement. So let's just jump for a moment to the third source. I promise I'll bring it all together in a minute. So the third source comes from Mishnah Yoma. So the Mishnah is the oral tradition. It gets codified about the 2nd century CE. It is the rabbis studying the text of the Torah and trying to figure out what that actually means for real life. Right, so we have this text that says, practice self-denial. But what does that actually mean? What do you do to practice self-denial? And so the rabbis engage in a discussion of what that might be. And so the Mishnah, which is then, we call it the oral tradition. It gets written down in the 2nd century when a famous rabbi by the name of Rabbi Judah the Prince is scared that it will be lost because oral traditions tend to be forgotten, and so he writes it down, and it gets written down in different sections. Mishnah Yoma, because Yom Kippur is the section that discusses the holiday of Yom Kippur. And so they write down, they say, on Yom HaKippurim, which is Yom Kippur, it is forbidden to eat, to drink, to wash, to anoint oneself, which is using oils, to put on sandals, which we use today as meaning referring to leather shoes, or to have intercourse. A king or bride may wash their face. Seems to be a sense of who has the more difficulty with self-denial, and right, what the standards of self-denial are. A woman after childbirth may put on sandals, according to Rabbi Eliezer, but the sages say not even that. And this is still practiced to today. To different extents, some people might not eat or drink, might still wear shoes that are more comfortable, right? Different people will practice very differently, but the fasting, people will have a practice, so there's a sense of not showering, very minimal washing, not using like perfumes, makeup, all of those types of things on this day. So now I want to use this to set the scene. Because now, when you understand what Yom Kippur is, you have this day that ends up translating into a 25-hour day. 25 hours because in Judaism, we start the day the night before, and there's a big debate as to whether the day begins and ends at sundown, when the sun starts to set, or when the stars come out. And because we're not really sure, we start when the sun sets, but we end when the stars come out. This is all very Jewish right now, right? So you end up with 25 hours in which you are not eating, you are not drinking. You might be wearing different shoes than what you're usually wearing. You're not showering. And for those of you who have ever engaged in a long-term fast, especially the food's not the hardest part, the water is, right? For those of you who know, let me actually back up to say, and instead we end up spending almost the entire time at the synagogue in prayer because you have nothing else to do. So you end up with this incredibly extended prayer. And so when you get to about 11:30 in the morning is probably when we're doing this Torah reading. And I'll say this year, the fast started about 6:30 p.m. So by the time you get to 11:30 the next morning, it's like the rough part. Right? For those of you who have done this, there's sort of this like dip, right? So like it gets really hard, and then you get to like 4:30 or 5, and you're like, I can do this for a week, right? You can like get on the upswing again. And then the fast is over, and you can eat, and you're like, I don't need to anymore, right? Because it's all about the rules. It's not really about hunger. Right, so you're really at one of your lowest points. And so at this lowest point of the day, we now have this Torah reading. We've just read the rules of this Torah reading. We've read this phrase, which gets repeated in both Leviticus and Numbers, right? So ta'anu et nafshotechem, v'initem et nafshotechem. So for those of you who also don't read Hebrew, maybe you can see there's some repetition in the symbols. So the last two words are the same, right to left. So the last two words are the same. The root of the first one, anah. So ta'anu is you shall deny. V'initem is also in biblical Hebrew, right? You shall deny. And so we get to this point where we're talking about this, and you're starting to really like feel the struggle of this. You're really, okay, this is what God commanded of us, right? I'm feeling this suffering here. And then the rabbis say, okay, after the Torah reading, we always read a section of prophets. As a fun fact, throughout the year, we will have read every section of the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We will not have gone through all of prophets or all of writings. That's the way we divide up the books. So the rabbis are making very intentional choices of what prophets are getting read and how and when. And so just at that point is when all of a sudden we get Isaiah chapter 58. And Isaiah chapter 58 is kind of like a kick in the gut, right? No pun intended, right? Just at this moment. Right, because this is where, and I have this on the back of your source sheet, I gave you the full chapter. We don't have to go into all of it, but I wanted to give you the full context. Right, and this is when God is basically saying, right, like the people, they're seeking me daily, they want to be eager, they want to be near to God. And in verse 3, right, why when we fasted did you not see us? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? Right? Okay, so this is it, right? Like on our fast day, we're starving our bodies and we're saying to God, why aren't you listening to us? And God is responding and saying, on your fast day, you see to your business and you oppress all your laborers. You fast in strife and contention, you strike with a wicked fist. Your fasting today is not such as to make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast I desire, a day for men to starve their bodies? Is bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast, a day when the Lord is favorable? No. This is the fast I desire. To unlock fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. I can't overstate the fact that the rabbis have chosen this to be the reading at this moment. Right? There is nothing that requires this to be what we read on Yom Kippur. And in the moment when you're feeling this suffering so much, to have somebody get up in front of the congregation and read this chapter in which God is saying, I don't care if you're fasting, on the holiest day of the year, when we believe that our fate for the entire year will be sealed, when we pray about who will live and who will die, who will have health and who will be sick, who will have suffering and who will have success, we say, God says, I don't want this. And yet we've got like 7 more hours to go. Right, so when we talk about Isaiah chapter 58, that's the commentary that the rabbis want to give us, right? Not just literally what Isaiah 58 says, but the rabbis want to say this is what Isaiah needs to teach us. And I think it's not unnoteworthy that not only is this quoting specifically in response to everything we're doing that day, but there's a playoff of the text also that I wanted to bring up, right? So if you look at these verses, I wanted to highlight these 2 verses. So I just brought Numbers 29. It could have been Leviticus, right? We've already said those 2 verses were pretty parallel. V'initem et nafshotechem, right? And notice Isaiah 58:10. V'nefesh na'ana taspia. Okay, so again, I told you had to practice your Hebrew, right? So the third word in the first line, nafshotechem, we now see appear in the first part here in Isaiah, right? Nefesh. And then that v'initem, you could see that same root, na'ana. Just have to trust me if you don't read Hebrew. But I hope you can see some of the symbols within it, right? And what is coming up specifically in this verse here, it translates as satisfy the famished creature. Right, so now it's not about our own self-denial. It's not about our own starvation. But now it becomes about the starvation of somebody else that we are meant to counter. That's what God is calling upon us to do. And what becomes even more significant, and I didn't bring this part specifically on the slide, but if you kind of, maybe look at your finger, if you kind of look at verse 9, it says, then when you call, the Lord will answer. It's translated as, as tikra Hashem ya'aneh. It's actually the same word as na'ana. The different translation, right? That same root of this self-denial, of this suffering, becomes the same word for answering. Right? So what is it that we're seeking? Are we seeking our own suffering, right? Are we taking pleasure in this feeling, right? There's this sense sometimes that when you engage so deeply in self-denial, you can actually become pretty full of yourself. Right? Like, I'm doing a great job fasting right now. And so here, right, what actually we're talking about is that it's not about the focus on the denial. The focus is on removing it from other people and ultimately on God's response. Right? That's the play on words that Isaiah is making. In a sense, the rabbis are trying to say Isaiah chapter 58 is actually a response to the Leviticus and the Numbers text. God has called upon us to deny things to ourselves, but in fact that denial only works not if you then think that you're so good at that denial, but if in your denial you have taken what you are giving up and giving it to somebody else. The value is not in not eating, it's saying, if you're not going to eat today, what are you doing with the food you would have otherwise been consuming? And have you found the person who needs that food, and have you made their hunger go away? Have you satisfied them? Not because you should take pride in your suffering, because the other risk in taking pride in your own suffering is that you then think there's a value in this other person's suffering. I see this person suffering, and instead of saying, can I relieve that suffering, I say, how holy they must be. Or what reward God will give them for their suffering. They don't want God's reward for their suffering. They want a meal. And so when we think about the things that we are told to give up on Yom Kippur, these are the things, it's the food, it's the drink, it's our clothing, it's our shoes. It's the extra comforts that we also often forget about. Okay, this person is hungry, so I'll give them the basic needs. When we make meals for ourselves, do we just eat the most basic of meals, or is there a flourish to it? Is it just about the clothing that we have, or do we like it to be a little bit nicer? We like to have a little bit of jewelry, maybe a little perfume, right? How do we make somebody feel whole again? And so I think it's important to emphasize that as we have this conversation, even as Isaiah stands up here in this text and says, this is not the fast that God wants, and even as we read that every Yom Kippur we start the fast again. We also don't give up the fast and the call for justice. It's also easy for us to read this text and see God saying, I don't want this, and say, great, I'm going to go home and I'm going to make myself a tuna sandwich and everything will be great. For us, reading this text on Yom Kippur and in response and in partnership with Numbers and Leviticus is hitting this text to say, I want the fast and I want this to be the meaning of your fast. Not as a counter to, but as a commentary on. Yes, on the 10th day of the 7th month, it will be a day of atonement and you should practice self-denial. And as you practice self-denial, think about how those practices can ultimately lead to the response that you want from God. And as you think about all of the ways over the course of the year that you have fallen short, the people you have slighted, the people you have hurt, think also of the people that you have ignored, the people you could have helped. And then think about the ways that you are going without on that day, and the ways you could also go without other days. Did you need that extra, whatever it was? Could you have shared that with somebody else? What could you have given that you kept for yourself? How was that meal too large that you could have shared it? Because in that moment, even as you're feeling it so deeply, you also know that you're okay. And I don't think the text is meant to mean skip lunch every day. We know Yom Kippur happens only one day a year. We're not meant to practice it every day of the year. But you practice it that one day of the year to remind yourself of who you want to be the rest of the days of the year. And so for us, reading Isaiah in that moment is both this charge calling us forward and also calling us out. What are the ways in which the fast that we are choosing is ultimately not about ourselves, and perhaps radically not even about God, but how is it about the community that we live in, the people that we touch, and in that makes us the people that we want to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. The irony of having snack bowls on the tables when was not lost on me this afternoon. It had already been purchased, so here we are. So I don't need to repeat a lot of what Rori has already told us about Isaiah 58. We know the context. We know what is contained in that chapter. But there are a couple things I want to say about Isaiah chapter 58 that struck me as I thought about them and read about them. One of them is that chapter 58 focuses on two words which have contrasting meanings. The first of those words occurs in verse 2. That word is it's translated in a couple of different ways, either desire or delight. And the contrast there is Israel's desire for fasting and external ritual, and God's desire for compassion for the poor. And the second word that has two contrasting meanings occurs in verse 3. The word is either affliction or humbling, and I hope I'm translating. I don't know Hebrew, so I don't know if I'm translating it correctly, but I went with the translation that I had. So Israel is devoted to afflicting itself with fasting, while God knows that they are neglecting the afflicted who are in their midst. So God then proclaims in verses 6 through 12 the fast that He desires. And Rori has already read those verses, so I don't need to repeat them. So then, what is the meaning of Isaiah chapter 58 in terms of the Lenten fast? Rori addressed Isaiah 58 in the context of the Yom Kippur fast. I want to address Isaiah 58 in the context of the Lenten fast. So what is the meaning of Isaiah 58 in that context? I refer first to a commentary that I found in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops website, which says this: fasting is not genuine without reforming one's way of life. A true social morality will ensure prosperity. In the Catholic tradition, prosperity and peace are built upon the foundation of social justice. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then in the Catholic News Agency, I found something written by Deacon Sabatino Carnazzo, whom I had never heard of before. And he says this: the whole purpose of fasting is to put the created order and our spiritual life in a proper balance. It's my daughter. I will call her back. I'll repeat that line. The whole purpose of fasting is to put the created order and our spiritual life in a proper balance. So as I see it, these quotes mean three things. Probably means more than three, but I see three things in them. First, fasting is about the created order. Fasting is about the material world. Okay, so we fast, we do without food, and Rori said this too, so as to have more to share with those who don't have food. We fast in order to have more to share with those upon whom fasting is forced. Those who don't have enough to eat, who fast not because they want to, but because they have to. Second, fasting puts the created order back in balance. So, in a very small and symbolic way, fasting balances the disparity between the haves and the have-nots of the world. It's small because that which we give up doesn't really do much to right the imbalance between the haves and the have-nots. So it's symbolic. Or rather, it's small. But it's symbolic because fasting should direct our minds and our hearts to those who go hungry every day. And not just those who suffer from physical hunger, but those who suffer the hunger of being deprived their basic human rights. Those who suffer the hunger of unfulfilled or unappreciated potential. Those who suffer the hunger of lack of opportunity. Those who suffer the hunger of being viewed as inferior because of prejudice. Those who suffer the hunger of being unloved. And third, fasting is about our spiritual life. Our spiritual life is being in right relationship with God. But our spiritual life is more than that. Our spiritual life is also about being in right relationship with each other. And that means being in right relationship with every human being on this earth. So in other words, any deficiency in our love for the neighbor is a deficiency in our love for God. And we can know just how strongly we love God by how well and how strongly we love every person in the world. That's the call. Now I want to just offer a little bit of something that was also on the USCCB website, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, by a Father Daniel Mers. He points out that there are two notable times in Scripture where fasting occurred, which are important in salvation history. The first of those has to do with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were commanded to fast from eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Never said apple, by the way. It's been depicted that way. Does not say apple. And Adam and Eve broke that fast. And because of that, they sinned. And so humanity's fall began with the breaking of the fast. Eating broke the bond of right relationship between humanity and God. And then Father Mers says that Jesus, who is considered by Paul especially the new Adam, fasted for 40 days in the desert after his baptism. And he says that fasting prepared Jesus to preach his message of the reign of God. And the message of the reign of God was a message of God's justice. It was a message of healing. It was a message of sharing meals with anyone and everyone. It was a message of radical equality, in which everyone is a brother or a sister. And it was a message of wandering, which means it was a message of trust, of trusting only and completely in God. So, Jesus' keeping the fast reversed and restored right relationship with God. Adam and Eve's breaking of the fast broke that right relationship. Jesus' fasting restored that right relationship with God. And so Father Mers then points out 7 reasons within the Christian tradition why Christians fast. First, as a reminder that sin entered the world because Adam and Eve broke the fast. Second, because fasting is ultimately about fasting from sin. Third, Fasting reveals and strengthens our sense of dependence on God for literally everything. Fourth, fasting is a way of preparing to receive the Eucharist. Fifth, fasting is a way to prepare ourselves for baptism and actually to prepare ourselves for all of the sacraments. Sixth, fasting is a means of saving resources to give to the poor. And seven, fasting is a means of self-discipline. She's persistent. My daughter is persistent.
You sure it's not Mason?
Yeah, Mason is my 8-year-old grandson who just got a phone. The first time he ever called, he FaceTimed me. Hi, Grandpa Mark. Hi, Mason. How are you? All right, so then, one other little quote, and then a summation. This is the Catholic Bishop's statement on penance and abstinence. This is number 14 from that document. It says this: for all other weekdays of Lent, we strongly recommend participation in daily Mass and a self-imposed observance of fasting. In the light of grave human needs which weigh on the Christian conscience in all seasons, we urge, particularly during Lent, generosity to local, national, and world programs of sharing of all things needed to translate our duty to penance into a means of implementing the right of the poor to their part in our abundance. I'll repeat that. As a means of implementing the right of the poor, to their part in our abundance. That's something that is part of the Christian tradition since day one, that if someone owns more or has more than they need, and there is someone in need, then then my abundance belongs to them. It is theirs because God wants everyone in the world to share in the good things that God has created. It goes on. Let us witness to our love and imitation of Christ. This is during Lent. By special solicitude for the sick, the poor, the underprivileged, the imprisoned, the bedridden, the discouraged, the stranger, the lowly, and persons of other color, nationalities, or backgrounds than our own. A catalog of not merely suggested but required good works under those headings is provided by our Blessed Lord Himself in His description of the Last Judgment in the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. This word of the Lord is necessary for all the year, but should be heeded with double care during Lent. So I hope you can see there, and these are my concluding remarks, that there is an intrinsic connection, a necessary connection, as you can see in both in light of Judaism and Christianity, a necessary and intrinsic connection between fasting and God's justice. It's revealed in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's revealed in the Christian Scriptures, it's revealed in Christian history. So fasting, at the end of the day, is a way to focus our attention on and also put into action God's desire for every person in this earth to have a full life and to flourish. Thanks. So now it's your turn. Please address your questions, comments, and if you would, speak loudly. This is the only mic we have, and I like to hog it. So, please. Yes?
I know in the Catholic faith we have like exceptions on some fasting according to age. Are
Yes.
there any exceptions for people with Jewish faith?
So, for those who, just to make sure everyone heard the question, it has to do with if there's exceptions to fasting. Depends on who you ask. So, obviously, no fast should ever endanger somebody's health. So, we do have what we call minor fasts. There's, I think, about 6 minor fasts throughout the year, and then Yom Kippur, and then there's one other 25-hour fast in the summer. The minor fasts were much quicker to say people should disregard, but for Yom Kippur, because it's in the Bible, people are really encouraged to do so unless it's pretty significant, which usually involves, consulting with a doctor and having a doctor say that it's not safe. Certainly, if somebody at all becomes sick, they immediately should stop their fast. There is also, this is again very true, Jewish. Right, so I often think that in Judaism we get accused of being overly legalistic, but we really do it out of love, right? So we're just like a group of lawyers. So there's we have a discussion about what qualifies as eating or not, right? Like how much. So there's a sense that if it's less than an ounce, like every 10 minutes, we don't count that as really eating. So actually, like I was pregnant over a Yom Kippur in my first trimester. It was really very challenging. Challenging just like in discomfort, not medically challenging. And so, I went before and I bought some bottles of Gatorade in a little shot glass, and I at one point was like sitting on my recliner like with a watch and just like, and that technically I didn't break my fast. Also, by the way, like an ounce of Gatorade every 10 minutes does not make you feel any less hungry. But no, nobody should ever be put into danger for it. But there's not a category in which somebody immediately is considered to be exempt. But certainly, if somebody needs to take food for medication purposes, or if somebody becomes ill, or somebody is told not to fast by their doctor, then it becomes forbidden to fast because nobody should put their life in danger for it.
When do children start?
So children will typically start after their bar or bat mitzvah, which is about the age of 13. In some traditions, 12 for girls. Some might start a little bit earlier. Usually they'll do it kind of like out of practice. So, they might try to make it until noon, just because it's hard to jump into 25 hours. But they're not considered to be obligated until after their bar or bat mitzvah.
Mark, so we had Isaiah, your talks on Isaiah last month.
Yep.
And you said that we have 3 different Isaiahs.
Yes.
Which one wrote chapter 58? And does it matter?
The second.
Which one wrote Isaiah?
Second Isaiah. And the tip-off that this is second Isaiah is that the reference is post-exilic. So the folks have returned, and the fast that they had been observing while in exile, they are now continuing to observe now that exile is over. Okay, so it's second Isaiah.
I was just guessing.
Yeah, Jim?
For Rori, if I remember right, it was 1968 when the Yom Kippur War happened. How did the military in Israel reconcile their military requirements to defend the country against their religious requirements to observe Yom Kippur?
Well, certainly, any time life is in danger, life always takes precedent. We're taught in the Jewish tradition that there are 3 commandments for which one would be obligated to give up their life. So if somebody says, kill this person or I'll kill you, right? So you can't take another life. Worshiping other gods and certain illicit relationships. But other than that, life takes precedent over everything. So, Yom Kippur, the Yom Kippur War was so significant in terms of the Jewish tradition, not just in terms of Israeli history, but because it was specifically targeted at a time when, even today in Israel on Yom Kippur, the country essentially shuts down. And so even for secular Jews who might not be very practicing, not only is our work is closed, businesses are closed, it's sort of a joke that young kids will ride their skateboards on highways because there's no traffic on major highways, and so it becomes part of the adventure. The radio goes off, and so the challenge in 1968 when the Yom Kippur War broke out was how to tell people that it was happening. And it really violated the sanctity of the day because a lot of people didn't know, and so who was able to be called in and how they went about doing it. But, as soon as an emergency comes, you have people who might be, so people who are doctors will try to exchange their shifts, but if somebody has to work on Yom Kippur because you are a first responder in any way and you have to be on call for that, then that has to take precedence. And you might find someone who will try to fast while they're working, but if that becomes a challenge and your first priority is to saving this other life, then the rest of it becomes irrelevant. And I think that's in line with a lot of the teaching that we're talking about also. Ultimately, the fasting is supposed to get you to something else, and if in fasting you're so self-righteous that you miss the point of the fast, then the fast becomes irrelevant. So if you are going to, if you're an ambulance driver and, you're working on Yom Kippur and you might be slower to respond or make a mistake because you're not thinking clearly out of hunger, then that's not really what God wants either.
In so many other classes, you talked about how theology has kind of developed over the years, certain concepts. So in regards to what you both have shared and your understanding of purpose, is there, from a historical perspective, has there been developments over the years, or this has been something that's been pretty well thought and understood for forever?
Are you talking about the fast itself or the meaning of the fast?
The more the meaning of it, in terms of this, it's about, worrying about helping the poor, and being concerned about others.
I don't know a whole lot about the history of fasting within Christianity. I do know that in the very earliest years, there was great concern about sharing what those who had with those who didn't, it's written about in a kind of glorified way in the Acts of the Apostles, that everyone shared everything in common. And I can also say that the order of the deacon was originally primarily focused on taking care of the poor among the Christian community. That was one of the, if not the primary, that was one of the primary functions of the deacon. I think over time, and Father Bill, if he starts shaking his head like this, we'll know that I'm wrong. Fasting began to take on, an aura of self-mortification and a participation in the sufferings of Christ. Okay, so that was very much, and I can remember Sister telling me when I was a boy, well, we didn't fast when we were that little, but we, abstained from meat on Friday and all that kind of thing. That, our doing without was a way of participating in Christ's suffering. So I think, for a long, long time in Christianity, there was a lot of negativism, a negative attitude about the body and anything having to do with the body, and so this was kind of a mortification that was pleasing to God.
I'll just add to that. For the Jewish tradition, it's not clear when the liturgy gets established fully, and so when Isaiah becomes part of the Yom Kippur liturgy. Yom Kippur originally doesn't have a liturgy. If you read the Bible, it's about pushing a goat off a cliff and a lot of temple service and stuff like that. So this whole idea of reading the Torah comes very much post the destruction of the temple. So we're going back probably about 1,500 years or so, but I think that even though I do think that what we've talked about here is the original intent that the rabbis have laid out, I don't think that that has been consistently understood throughout. And so for as much as I'm setting the scene for you, the reality on the ground is that most Jews don't read Hebrew fluently. Even for those who read fluently in Hebrew, the text of Isaiah is not necessarily, the most smooth text. And I'm saying that we read it at the most difficult time, which means most people are probably spacing out. So I think there's kind of a sense of like, okay, the next page in the book says we say these words. There's not always really, so how often do we go through our liturgy and then stop to say, what does it mean that somebody established this as the liturgy? So I would argue that that was always the intent, but not consistently understood.
I don't get it. I told a bunch of people that when I was going to high school back in Pittsburgh, my school was 70 to 75% Jewish. So I have a lot of friends in high school, youth, all that. And I don't remember ever having anything happen on Yom Kippur. Does it fall on the weekend? Because not during the school time did I ever see 70% of the kids not show up.
So it goes according to the Hebrew calendar, which means that it shifts constantly. This year it was a Wednesday. Next year it will be a Monday. My dad's kind of a calendar buff, so I can tell you that it can be a Monday, a Wednesday, and a Thursday, and a Saturday. It cannot be a Friday or a Sunday, as a fun fact, and I forget if it can be a Tuesday. So it would, and that just has to do with everybody's personal practices. So for a lot of people, they might still stay home on that day and be with their families. Some people might choose to still go to school. And it's up to each individual person whether they are going to school but fasting or whether they're still eating. I will say, across the spectrum in terms of the Jewish community, Yom Kippur is considered more significant, so people might not be very practicing of the holiday of Sukkot, but Yom Kippur kind of the Passover Seder I think is like the most practiced ritual in Judaism according to whatever survey somebody told me they quoted. But I think Yom Kippur is probably second on that list. But I can't really comment on every person still makes their personal choices about what they do.
Okay.
I would imagine some of them were staying home and it was just a Wednesday and you might not have noticed.
Can I ask an off-the-board question that's always wondered about? The Jewish people bury their dead before sunset? What is the tradition behind that?
We try to bury our dead as soon as possible. And so traditionally we just try not to delay it. There's just a sense that burying the dead is the most sacred act you can do for another person. It's the act that you never expect to be repaid for, and that bodies should be treated as holy vessels, that having held a soul and then losing the soul actually makes the body very sacred. And so we just try to do it as quickly as possible and as reverently as possible. And so typically, like within Israel, it tries to be actually that day, and so it can be later on because they try to do it immediately. In the United States, and again, I'm saying in the very traditional sense, certainly other factors come into play and people make their own choices, but very often, whenever possible, you'll usually have it within 2 days of the person passing.
Thank you.
Jake, you got a question?
Yeah, a couple of things, Mark. First off, it sounds like the Jewish religion says you shouldn't eat. Catholic religion says you can just eat a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the Yom Kippur fast. Well, except for the Gatorade, is pretty much an absolute fast. Where the Lenten fast is not not as strict.
Thank goodness for mac and cheese. Now, my other problem is the logistics of the commandments. It's easy for me to say, I'm not going to eat. Now, part of that is I'm supposed to give it elsewhere. Does that mean I have to find somebody to give it to? Do I give it to a charity? That just seems to be, there doesn't seem to be any connection here that that provides for that kind of
Yeah.
option.
No,
I'm open.
Rice bowl.
that's it.
I know about it, thank you.
No, it's a good question and a fair question. And you know, in my remarks, I mentioned that the fast helps to right the imbalance between the haves and the have-nots of the world, but it does it in a small and symbolic way. So when I said it was symbolic, I meant that it can create in us a different kind of mindfulness. Not necessarily that the mac and cheese I have left over I should bring to Lee or to somebody else. Yeah, he's got plenty. But that I should have the mindfulness as I'm fasting to be thinking about a way to respond to the needs of those who are going hungry. Does that make sense?
So Vincent de Paul qualifies.
St. Vincent de Paul?
Vincent
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. They do all kinds of wonderful things to feed and help people in need.
So it's a question of an in-kind kind of contribution that we're talking about.
It's really up to each individual, how he or she wants to share their abundance. You're leading me into the commercial part of the evening.
I charge for that.
Oh, yeah. So starting next Wednesday, and for 2 Wednesdays, I'm going to be talking about the prophetic role of the laity in the Catholic Church. Okay, and so this topic is going to come up about the imbalance, the tremendous imbalance between the haves and the have-nots of the world, and how we as Catholic Christians, as part of our mission, our prophetic mission, to help right that imbalance, to help correct that imbalance, both by the way we deal with our own, personal possessions, and also by the way we vote and advocate and do all kinds of other things. So we will get into that particular thing over the next two Wednesdays.
You're welcome.
That was a very Mishnaic question, though. That's exactly the type of, sorry, I just wanted to say that's a very Mishnaic question, right? So, everyone says something and then somebody says, but how much do you actually need? What is the price of a mac and cheese?
Yeah, Joe?
For Rory, Yom Kippur I've always seen as the culmination of the High Holy Days. How is it connected with the preceding days?
So Yom Kippur, in some ways it is and in some ways it's not. Yom Kippur is actually the second of 4 holidays that all happen within 4 weeks. And that's why the last 2 get kind of the short end of the stick. So Yom Kippur we do say is connected to Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah is the new year. It is the anniversary of the day when we believe God created Adam, which also means it's the anniversary of the day of the first sin, because we believe that Adam sinned on the day that he was created, Adam and Eve. And so Rosh Hashanah is both a celebration of the birthday of the world, as well as also the time when we start what we would consider the days of atonement and the time of repentance, and ultimately culminating in Yom Kippur. So we like to say in the liturgy, we say on Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. So this idea that there's this 10-day period in which, like, Rosh Hashanah is when God first evaluates all the people and kind of writes, like, in pencil what God thinks should happen that year. And then you've got these 10 days, and we say that repentance, prayer, and charity can change that fate that was written. And Yom Kippur is then when it gets sealed. And then 4 days after Yom Kippur, we start the holiday of Sukkot, which is the holiday when we build those outdoor huts, if any of you have seen that, and we live in those for 7 or 8 days out here in the diaspora. And even though those are separate holidays, we often see a spiritual connection there, where Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is all about this kind of, internal working. And we say that there's this tendency on Yom Kippur at this culmination, when you've reviewed everything that you've done and you've thought about all the ways that you sin, you say, you know what, the way that I sin is by interacting with others. I'm just going to stay home and hide in my basement, and I'm going to do a lot better. And then you're commanded to leave your house and to move out. You have to be out in the world. And so we do that for 8 days. We live in the Sukkah. And then there's actually one more holiday, which is known even less, which is called Shmini Atzeret, which is the 8th day, which is just a festival. But here we also call it Simchat Torah, the celebration of the Torah, because it marks when we have finished reading the entire cycle, ending with Deuteronomy. We take out all of our Torahs. We have a massive party. We dance. There's often drinking. It's kind of like a wedding, but with the Torahs at the center instead of brides and grooms. And then we roll the Torah and we start again from the very beginning with this idea that we don't have a break. So we read about the end and the death of Moses and all of that, and then we go right back to where we started. So I don't actually think of Yom Kippur as the culmination in some sense. Like, it's the culmination of the Days of Atonement, but we actually pair those Days of Atonement with then this time of intense joy and really like return to community in the wider world, because you get like a day to sort of focus on yourself, and then the rest of it you got to go back out there.
Seems like in the Catholic religion, we have a similar focus. They do it for 8 days, but we've had now saints, probably many of them, but that went out into the desert, and lived out there for years and years and years doing the same thing.
Yes. Yes, there were originally individuals who went out into the desert and fasted, or sat in a tree, or sat on top of a pillar, or something, and
like saying
they
in a cave.
mortified themselves. Yeah. The monastic movement was actually a communal offshoot of that kind of lifestyle, which was really an attempt to reform Christianity, which they believed had gotten too soft and had gotten too easy. So they wanted to, live a stricter life in imitation of Jesus.
If I can just comment on that. So we also have monastic traditions in Judaism. They're not as popular, and I think we tend to be highly critical of them. But just in that spirit, if I can, I want to share one of my favorite stories that we learn about as part of the Talmud, the oral tradition. It tells the story of a man named Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lives during the period of the Romans and is publicly critical of the Roman authorities to the point where a price is put on his head. And so he runs and he escapes into a cave with his son. And it describes him living this totally ascetic life in which they bury themselves in the sand to kind of protect themselves and their clothes. They study Torah, they're just talking to each other, they stop only to pray, and this miracle occurs, and a carob tree grows outside, and they have water, and they have food, and they survive that way for 12 years. And after 12 years, Elijah comes, because that's who has to come, right? So Elijah comes and stands outside the cave, and I love the imagery, by the way, because it's Elijah passes by and is like, I wonder if anyone told that guy that the emperor died, right? And that's his way to tell Shimon Bar Yochai that it's safe to come out. Shimon Bar Yochai comes out and he sees a man tilling his field, and he thinks this is what this man is I've been spending 12 years becoming so holy. He's wasting his time on his field. And as he's thinking that and looking at this field, everything he looks at bursts into flames. And a voice comes out of heaven and says, "Get back into the cave."
It doesn't sound like the Baltimore Catechism.
Right, actually, what it says you missed the point, right? You have to learn some more. And he goes back, he learns for one more year, and then he comes out and he figures out a way. You had a question?
Yeah, every time we have a service, we are blessed because we have Father Bill to preach. Are there sermons or messages from your rabbis during Yom Kippur?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, every service we have just about. So we do our biggest service during the week in my tradition. So I'm part of the Orthodox tradition. In my denomination, it's Saturday morning is our big service. In some parts of the community, in the Reformed denominations, Friday night might be a larger service where there might be a sermon. So typically we'll have a sermon at least once a week. And then on Yom Kippur, there's actually often 3 sermons that take place. And we have a very significant service the evening of Yom Kippur. We have a prayer called Kol Nidre, which is probably one of the most famous prayers in the Jewish liturgy, which is really about absolving all promises. So we basically say, whatever promise we made between last year and this year, erase it because we probably didn't do it and we don't want it to count against us right now. And absolve us of that. And so there's often a sermon after Kol Nidre, and then Yom Kippur morning, and then we often will have a sermon before the final prayer on Yom Kippur, which is called Ne'ilah, which means the closing of the gates. In ancient times, it would have been when they actually closed the gates of the temple, but really marks the end of the holiday. So usually somebody will give a sermon before that as well. So Yom Kippur is also the biggest day for working rabbis.
We Christians have a tradition of original sin, where we are baptized in order to be freed from that. Evidently, the Jewish religion does not. So there's no baptism in your faith. People, when they die, they go to heaven or hell.
So that's always a good question. We don't. So the question actually in and of itself is not a really Jewish question. Like the truth is, we don't talk about it very much. Most of the time when we start getting Jewish sources on the afterlife, it's highly impacted by Christian views of the afterlife. So Jews will talk about heaven and hell, but we usually mean Christian heaven and hell. There is a notion, I mean, we talk about a world to come, and we will talk about, there is a sense that there is like up to a year in which a soul might be in some kind of, I wouldn't quite call it purgatory, but that might be the best translation, but maybe not. I'm not Christian, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. But there might be like, so what I started off by saying, just because you're forgiven doesn't mean that there's not a punishment that still, so for those of you who are parents, right, someone can say sorry and you're still grounded for a week. So, right, so the sense that, you could, certain sins, one could ask for forgiveness and that's enough of atonement. There's some sins where one has to ask forgiveness, and then there's like what we would call like a certain amount of suffering. I don't mean intense suffering, but and it could be anything from, like you picked up the wrong coat, right? Like, these like annoyances that life has that sort of like helps clean your slate. Some say that, you need Yom Kippur to atone, and then some things we say death itself has to atone. But there is a sense sometimes that if a person still has like things on their slate, on their scorecard, right, that there's up to a year in which there might be some amount of suffering, we don't know what that is, that then they become absolved. There's a tradition, so people will do things in this world as a merit for the soul. So when someone passes, we might do learning, and we would say we're learning in the merit of so-and-so. You give charity in the merit of so-and-so. And there's special prayers that you can say in someone's merit. Traditionally, a child will say the prayers for their parent for 11 months, because while we think that you might need up to a year, we're pretty confident you don't need the full year. So we stopped just before. It's like our plug for everyone. So, and then, we don't really know. There's some sources that talk about what the world to come looks like, but the reality is that we're much more focused on the life we need to live in this world, and I think just kind of figure there's no point in stressing out over what we're never, by the time you get the answer, it's kind of too late. So we're sort of just focused on what we have control over here, and I think also believe that we're placed in this world because we have a role to play here, and our job is to make this world a better place, and we'll worry about the next world when we have to worry about the next world.
Sure.
How about when you say 12 years old, that they go through the bar mitzvah, right? What is it that you're conveying on the child at 12?
So it's 13 is more traditionally, sometimes 12 for a young girl in some traditions. We say that that's the age of obligation. So just like in American society, 18 is when you become a legal adult. So all of a sudden, you know, your parents don't have to pay your bills anymore, you know, whatever it might be, and you don't actually have to do anything, you just are. That's kind of it. So we have a ritual where we mark it. So we invite them to like lead services or read from the Torah, because we do communal prayers, and there's an idea that the only person, so certain prayers, if there's a communal prayer, one person can lead a prayer on behalf of the community only if they are equally or more obligated in the prayer. So a child can't lead the community in the prayer, they have no obligation in the prayer. So kind of symbolically, when the obligation comes on, we have them get up and do it for everyone. And again, different children will do different amounts. But people will say, you know, oh, I was never bar mitzvahed. It's not like a thing that has to happen. Like you turn 13 and you, right? So like when you turn 18, it doesn't matter if people throw you a party, you know, like legally I can still sue you. So.
Okay.
If I could, I want to build on something that Ken asked about and that Rory responded to. And Rory was talking about you know, this focus on this life and living this life well, and that is really the focus of both Jewish and Christian ideas of social justice. That this world and this life do matter, and that, you know, hungry people in the world, you know, that is a wrong that needs to be righted. That homeless people need to find shelter, you know, all those kinds of things. So that's really what at least Catholic social justice does, is add a real sense of urgency to this life, that it matters, that people who are not allowed to flourish in this world be given the opportunity to flourish.
On that note, then, when did we start moving away from the tradition of what goes on here to what goes on in heaven? Because it seems like it's going to sound silly, but what Christ did, what Jesus did, from what Rori has said, is very Jewish, obviously. You know,
He was.
What goes on here matters. You know, what we do here matters to make things better matter, but you see a lot of, and you see it, I think, in Catholicism as much as you do other Christian faiths, that it's all about the afterlife and not so much about this life.
Yeah.
When did that view begin to change?
Wow. I mean, there's a 30-minute answer to that question that I won't give you, but let me try to boil it down this way. After the destruction of the temple, I'm not going to go from 70 CE to 2019, I promise, but after the destruction of the temple, Christians began to ask themselves, and as the first generation of believers began to die, Christians began to ask themselves, well, is Jesus coming back? Or when is Jesus coming back? Okay? Because, you know, there were some, or maybe many, who believed that it would be in their lifetime. And then it didn't happen. So over time, the eschaton, the end of the age, the end of time, was stretched out into an unknown future. And so what happens to people who die in the interim? Well, they are judged. Purgatory came around, you know, later on, and they meet their eternal reward in preparation for that time when Jesus returns. That's the 2-minute answer. Yeah.
This is for Rori. Could you share with us a little bit about what your role is in your synagogue?
Oh, that's the 30-minute question. So right now, my full-time job right now is
Repeat the question.
what my role is in my synagogue. So officially, my full-time job is I'm the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. That is not a faith-based. I mean, it's a. This is the fun thing about Judaism. Our organizations, like being Jewish, is not faith-based, and so that's that organization is tasked with building relationships with other faith, ethnic, civic, and religious political groups, and working together on issues important to our region. Prior to that, I worked at a congregation. I was essentially the assistant rabbi there, and I'm still very much affiliated with the congregation. So for me, I'm from a tradition that has not ordained women, and then I'm part of an early group of women to go through an ordination process. And so we do have strict separations between men and women in the congregation. If you came to my synagogue, men and women sit separately. We only have men lead prayers, but my role includes giving the sermon, teaching classes, offering pastoral counseling, and then like all the stuff that faith leaders do that nobody likes to talk about, like changing the light bulbs and making sure there's, like all of the other stuff that goes into just having a house of worship. So I really worked alongside the rabbi and often tag teamed with him, other than leading prayers, unless we would create women's spaces for prayer, in which case I would have a leadership role in that.
Seeing no more hands, I'll give my final commercial. Last week I bounced a topic in an email to Rori, and which she thought would be a worthy topic for another presentation. Would you all be open to that? As she said, what else are you going to say? No, we don't want her back here. So we will plan that probably for sometime in the spring, or as Rory's schedule permits. Okay, so hey, thank you all for coming out tonight. I really, really appreciate it. Hope you found this to be helpful.